In this video, I'm talking about things to avoid doing when you're active listening. The first is dismissive comments. And these are basically comments that express or imply that whatever they're talking about is not a big deal. So for all of these, I'm going to give some examples in terms of how you would respond to this statement. So the talker says, "When my roommate invites me to go out partying, she gets really offended when I say no. Sometimes I just don't want to. But then she'll make these really underhanded comments until I cave." So a dismissive response to that would be, sometimes you just have to let things go, or underhanded comments aren't the end of the world. The second thing to avoid when you're active listening is avoiding the issue. And oftentimes this will take the form of factual questions about the situation that sort of don't get at the heart of the matter. So an example of a response to the same person that would be avoiding the issue is, what clubs do you go to when you go out? Or how much do you drink when you go out? Those are just factual questions that kind of communicate that you're not quite comfortable talking about the real issue that this person is presenting. So you're skirting that issue by focusing on something that's not that emotional. And when you do that, of course, people will accurately interpret that as you're not comfortable going here, avoid talking about this kind of thing. And so the person who said this is likely to respond by not bringing up personal stuff with you because they interpret that probably correctly as you're not comfortable going there. You're not comfortable with the conflict or the emotional tension of talking about this particular issue with them. So the third thing to avoid when active listening is advice giving. And I have a whole other video on why it's important to avoid advice giving, but the basic idea is that it hijacks a person's story about them and makes it about you and what you would do. So instead of listening to their conflict and their struggle, people want to be the hero of their own story, and when you give advice, you're taking the role of the hero and imposing your values and your perspective and your intelligence on their situation that they probably want to take ownership over, that they probably want their agency to be what solves that problem. And advice giving can also sometimes place a burden on the relationship because a lot of people do get offended if you don't take the advice they give. So it's this extra burden that you're adding on top of the problem they already have. So an example of advice giving in response to this person would be, have you tried the broken record method? Or have you tried calling out her underhanded comments? Oftentimes advice giving takes the form of a question like, have you tried? But it's still advice giving, and it still generally doesn't feel very good to someone who's sharing a problem with you. The next thing to avoid when active listening is deep, unrelated questions. So an example of this would be if you were to respond to this person by saying, how does the dynamic with your roommate relate to the relationship with your mother? And oftentimes this will happen when someone really wants to go deep when they're active listening, and they're trying to force that, but they're doing it in a way that is not in touch with where the other person's head is at. So active listening requires being in tune with where is this person I'm listening to feeling the conflict and tension. And if you bring in some other part of their life that might or might not have conflict or tension and try to impose that because you're trying to go deep, that feels a little bit off and can be very awkward. So the fifth thing to avoid when active listening is leading questions. And these are questions that contain the answer, where it's obvious the way the person's supposed to answer. So an example in this case would be, in what ways is her behavior passive-aggressive? So you've already assumed an interpretation and you're trying to impose that interpretation onto this person. So I'd like to give a couple more examples of things people could say and what each of these 5 pitfalls would look like in that case. Let's imagine that you're listening to someone and they say, there's some things I don't like about my church back at home, but there's also some things I really miss about it. I miss that part of my life. And I feel like I can't talk about it even to my closest friends here. So a dismissive response to that would be, some people just don't want to hear about the church lives of their friends. Avoiding the issue would be, what denomination is your church at home? Advice giving would be, have you thought about asking your friends here if they would be comfortable with you talking about your church back home? Deep, unrelated questions would be, how did you come to believe in God? And leading questions would be, how does fear of vulnerability come into play here? A better way of responding would be to use an echo question or just an open-ended question. So an echo question would be like, you don't feel like you can talk to your friends? Or an open-ended question might be something like, what about your friends here makes it difficult to bring up something like this? And then the third example that I'd like to use is where the talker says, my girlfriend doesn't always stand up for me when her friends make complaints about me. I hear about this secondhand, and it makes me wonder whose side she's really on. A dismissive response would be, it's not that big of a deal though. What would you expect her to do? Avoiding the issue would be, how many friends does your girlfriend have? Advice giving would be, if I were in your situation, I would try couples counseling with my girlfriend. A deep, unrelated question would be, what kinds of things do you and your girlfriend usually fight about? And a leading question would be, do you think having a conversation with your girlfriend is the right way to go? Okay, I guess that last one is also a little bit advice giving, but lead-in questions sort of relate to advice giving, so fine. A better way to respond to this would be to use an echo question, such as, she doesn't always stand up for you, or else, you hear about this secondhand. Or an open-ended question, such as, what kinds of things have you considered doing about this? So that's just 5 things to avoid when you're active listening. These are common mistakes that people make, and if you can learn to avoid doing those, the conversation is just going to feel safer and the person will feel more supported by your active listening.